Hello and welcome to A Gypsy's Kiss, the vlog. I'm Shelley Carney.
And I'm Toby Eunice. Stick with us for a few minutes and we'll pick up where we left off last week.
We got the Pilar video out.
We did. Yeah, finally.
Hope you got to see it. It was a lot of fun to make.
Yeah. And we're going to do more like that. We've got a recon coming up here, and I'm trying to decide between Arroyo Hondo. I was going to say Arroyo Seco. Rio Hondo and Tres Piedras.
Yeah.
Piedras.
Depending on if there's still flooding or if they've...
Yeah. So I'm going to go check it out this week, and then we'll probably go up next week and do the recon and shoot some video. So.
Yeah. So... where'd we leave off last week?
So we left off, I started thinking about it. I left you in a hold in a lot of different ways. So the first thing where we left off was you and I agreed, maybe none of the other researchers agreed, that it was unlikely that Forrest, because of the complexity, Forrest flew out of New Mexico, right? So the conclusion that led me to was this.
Fenn hid the treasure in New Mexico. Ta-da!
Now,
revelation.
That's a conclusion based
statement.
on what, it is. I thought it was, but I think I can substantiate it. It's not hard to provide evidence in a lot of ways of whether or not that's true. So
Okay, so let's see.
And this is the first one. In the book, before he writes the poem, he talks about what he did, how the process went through.
Yes.
And there's a quote there, and the exact quote, it's in the mountains somewhere north of Santa Fe. Now, let me ask you a question.
Paragraph right before the poem.
Right. If I told you that this weekend I was going on a recon for the treasure, and I was going someplace in the mountains north of Santa Fe, what would you assume?
Not that far north of Santa Fe, just...
Right.
In the region.
And even if it had nothing to do with the treasure, what if I just said I was going fishing somewhere in the mountains north of Santa Fe?
Well, probably one of the areas you normally, the Pecos or the Chama, somewhere that you normally would go that's within the region of Santa Fe. Otherwise, why would you say Santa Fe?
Right. So that was kind of the conclusion I came to. If I told you I was hiding something in the mountains north of Santa Fe, you wouldn't assume, nor would I be thinking, well, that means I hid it in Yellowstone Park in Wyoming. That's not a conclusion one comes to by making that statement. Right. So that's the first thing. He said he hid it in the mountains somewhere north of Santa Fe, believing that everybody was going. If you look at the clues that came after that, it's not in Idaho, it's not in Utah, it's not in Arizona. It's 300 miles west of Toledo. It's above 5,000 feet, below 10,000 feet. It's not on top of a mountain. It's not. Those all came afterwards.
Right.
After he told us where it was. He wrote that when he wrote the book. It was edited and it was published in that way.
Right.
So that's the first one. The second thing is New Mexico has been good to him.
Sure.
Now, one could argue that he spent a storied childhood in his summers with his family in Yellowstone Park. But if you read between the lines, those are the years where he had to take care of his family in a lot of ways, right? So it might have been storied in a lot of ways, but the simple fact of the matter is Fenn and his family arrived in New Mexico in 1972 with $20,000 that they had saved while in the military. And he transformed that over the next 17 or 18 years. He would have been 42. So he transformed that in the next 17 or 18 years into a multi-million-dollar art and artifact gallery that made for a beautiful home for his family, put his daughters through college, gave him a place, gained visibility and respect in Santa Fe and in New Mexico, gave him a gallery right there on the Paseo de Peralta in Santa Fe, one of the most visible galleries of its time. So he New Mexico was very, very good to him.
Sure.
And I don't ever recall stories in which he was mad at New Mexico for being good to him, right?
Right.
So that's the second thing.
And
so
he was
maybe
excited to move here. As it said in the book, his wife said he danced on his hat. He was so excited to move to Santa Fe.
Yeah.
And I have to look at well, you and Forrest have a lot of things in common in your lives. And you tell me a lot of stories about growing up. You point out places when we're driving to the, up the road and up to mountains north of Santa Fe. You point things out. I went camping over here.
Right.
We lived over this area. We did this. But I would never think that was, even though that's where you were born and raised, you talk a lot more and you have a lot more enthusiasm for your years when you lived in the D.C. area and you traveled around the world and you had a family.
I had never actually thought of that comparison, but that's a good, I don't think of myself in terms of my childhood in Santa Fe, which in a way was storied, I grew up fishing with my father. I camped in the mountains north of Santa Fe, et cetera, et cetera. I went to Catholic schools there all the way through St. Michael's, the all-boys boarding school. But I don't think of my life in that context. I think of it as the years that I spent in and around Washington, where I raised my family, where I built a great career, et cetera. That's really, I had never thought about that comparison. That's really interesting. Washington, D.C. was good to me. So if I was going to hide a treasure, I'd probably hide it out there in Wildcat Hollow off Route 50. So that's a really good comparison. He did have a great time in Yellowstone with his family, but it's New Mexico that was good to him. Occam's razor. Entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem.
Yeah. What he said.
It's Latin for entities should not be multiplied beyond their necessity. And I've always had the sense, if you talk with Forrest, he's a relatively uncomplex person. He has his focus on art, artifacts, and his family, right?
Yeah.
Trout fishing, maybe because they're byproducts of that, writing books. So he's very, very focused. Hiding it in New Mexico is the simplest of solutions, as we talked about last week. If you had to hide it someplace else, you make the solution complex, right? It becomes big and complex, and it leaves a paper trail. In addition to that, the effort, had he done it in New Mexico, can all be accomplished in one day. He could leave his home in the morning, drive 3 hours, and that would put him any place in the search area in New Mexico, any place.
Sure.
He could spend, and I doubt if it was actually this much, but he could spend an hour walking in to place the treasure chest, walk back to his car, get the treasure, put it into the treasure chest, do whatever concealment he decided upon, up to and including burying it, although I don't think he did that, walk back to his car, drive back to Santa, have the big laugh at the back of it, Forrest Fenn, well, did you just do that,
Yeah.
And then drive back to Santa Fe in time for dinner with Peggy.
Yeah.
So,
and I see that when he writes about his childhood, simple solutions, get it done quick and let's go. Days when he was a child and they needed extra food for the table, he'd go out in the front yard and shoot some birds. He didn't go out miles away to trap rabbits or shoot deer or anything else. Yeah. He stayed at home. He ran out in the yard. He got those birds and he brought them in.
Right. Yeah. There's a river. It has fish.
So that gives you
Let me
that
get
mentality,
some fish.
that character.
Yeah,
that he's got.
It's that the simplest solution is the best.
Yeah,
right.
Simple and get it done now, and let's get to dinner.
Right, without all that complexity that could get in the way. Number 5, warm waters, the plural, is a phrase that's unique to the New Mexico Game and Fish Department.
Right.
Checked all the other states. There is some mention of warm water, Montana especially. You will find warm water, the phrase warm water, and the word waters in the same paragraph. But there is no place in the Montana fishing regulations where warm waters is used as a single phrase. So that phrase is unique to New Mexico. Now, the qualifier there, of course, is it's unique in the context of fishing regulations.
Right.
But he's a lifelong fisherman, so it would make sense that he would rely upon it to provide him a clue. And then I think that was another one that tells me. And then here's the last one. And this leads us just a little bit further into substantiation of what I'm talking about. New Mexico is connected to the poem, based on all the things that we've talked about. It connects it to the poem in a way that no other state is connected. you can't draw. There's nothing in the poem that tells you it's on or near the Madison River or the fire hole or et cetera, et cetera. There's no direct connection. There is, in the case of New Mexico, a direct connection to the poem.
There is. New Mexico.
I have concluded so.
Oh, and how did you conclude so?
Because if you look at the first sentence in the poem, the first sentence, not the first stanza, it happens to be the first stanza, but it's the first sentence in the poem. It says, "As I have gone alone in there and with my treasures bold, I can keep my secret where and hint of riches new and gold." Now, if I translate that into prose rather than poetry, it says, I can keep the secret of where I hid my treasure because I went there alone. And I can talk about the riches, new and old, that I hid. That's how that translates into prose. If the only location that he could have hid the treasure in New Mexico is represented by the first line in the poem, which I believe it does, it's very clear, it's the only place he could have done, that also tells us something else about the poem. It tells us that no matter what... Oh, our gray lines have shown back up again. And here's the big thing that I believe is the unintended clue that I promised you last week. If indeed the first line in the poem is also the first clue, then it makes sense to me that the 9 clues in the poem are represented by the 9 sentences in the poem, not the 6 stanzas. I believe that to be true because Fenn has never said exactly where the first clue lies.
Right.
People have assumed that it is in the second stanza with the word "begin it where warm waters halt." Well, if you use that logic, you can take "begin it where warm waters halt," go down here, and by the time you're at stanza 4, you can easily count 9 clues, right? If you look at the second sentence, "begin it where warm waters halt and take it in the canyon down, not far but too far to walk, put in below the home of brown." That's the second stanza. You could count 4 clues there.
Well, yeah, directional clues.
Right. If you look at it from the sentence perspective and you say this line, sentence 2, beginning with "begin it where warm waters halt," is not 3 clues, it's 1. It's 1 clue. "Put in below the home of brown" is 1 clue. From there, it's no place for the meek. The end is ever drawing but nigh. There's no paddle up your creek, just heavy loads and waters high, is not 3, 4, or 5 clues. It's 1 clue. That justification comes when you realize that Forrest claims on regular occasion that it took him 15 years to write the poem. I had to ask myself, why would you spend 15 years writing a poem where you effectively framed the poem and threw away stanzas 1, 5, and 6 and put all the clues in stanzas 2, 3, and 4? The problem with it, realistically speaking, is that you're throwing away half the poem, stanzas 1, 5, and 6. But interestingly, you're throwing away 5 out of the 9 sentences in the poem. You're throwing away 55% of the poem and focusing on the 45% as the solution. Questions?
Can we go back for a second?
Sure.
I was just noticing some things. So, I'm going to read out of the book right after the poem, and then I'm going to talk about this.
Get close to your mic. Close, a little closer to your microphone.
All right. This is in the paragraph after the poem in the book, and he says, "It was vital that nobody share my knowledge about the location of the treasure. 2 people can keep a secret if one of them is dead." And here you see the word "I." 1, one eye. It's very obviously telling us he was the only one. He did it all by himself. He had no help from anybody. Nobody flew him anywhere. Nobody drove him anywhere. Nobody carried his luggage. Nobody did anything to help him do this. The secret is held by one person only, and that's Forrest. And of course, the riches, new and old, they're all his. He put them all in the box. He found them all. He owned them all. He bartered for them. They were all his. Mm-hmm. So one person did this. And I think he makes that point in the book a lot, where he talks about how one person can affect change or some sort of event across a great number of people by one person alone doing that. And I don't think he would have wanted to share any of that with anybody else besides keeping the secret. He wanted to be the one and only person doing this. He
shared that he had a treasure and his idea, the concept, with several people, including members of his family and the couple of authors in Santa Fe that he's good friends with. And of course, he had to share it with a photographer. What he didn't share is what he was going to do with it. I've got a treasure. I haven't decided what I'm going to do with it. He might even told him that he was going to hide it one day, and they'd laugh at him. Oh, Forrest, don't be crazy. You're not being crazy, are you, Forrest? You know what? No, Forrest, be serious. You know. But once he made the decision, and I think that was a day of serendipity. I don't think he planned that day. I think one morning he woke up and he said to himself, it's time for me. I'm 79 or 80 years old. I'm 68 years old. I'm 11 years younger than when he did that. And there are mornings where I wake up and I just want to go back to bed.
Sure.
On that morning, he said to him in his 1 hour worth of thinking that he does before
when you feel bad so much of the time, the one day you feel good, you're going to get up and make use of that day.
Exactly. And he's pretty sprightly even at his current age of 86. But the simple fact of the matter is, you think that you're in bed. He says he always stays in bed and thinks for an hour. Mm-hmm. And he's thinking to himself, you know what? Today's the day.
Mm-hmm. I feel good. The weather's good.
I'm doing this.
Right.
And you get up, you go to your office, you pick up the treasure. You may say goodbye to Peggy, although from what I understand, she didn't even know he was gone until he got back. So it ties in with that whole, I've got to do this myself. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to call Shiloh. I'm not going to go to the airport. I'm not going to rent a plane. I'm not going to rent a car. I'm not going to stay in a hotel. I'm going to do this, right? Mm-hmm. And it was the best and easiest solution. And I think we can count on that being true. So that leaves us at another wait till next week point. So if we can all agree that the 9 clues consist of the 9 sentences, and that the 9 clues do not begin at where warm waters halt, and that each sentence is one clue, it puts a completely different perspective on the poem, because up until this time, I think most searchers, and certainly I believed, that the poem could be graphed, if you will, on a 2-dimensional surface like a map.
Right, because it looks like you're being given directions.
Right.
Come to my house by doing this, 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 and this, and you'll get there. Right.
I want you to think about this. There's 2 ways I can give you directions to a location. And I'll tell you why in next week's episode.
So I'm glad that you tuned in and you stayed with us throughout the video. And we are looking forward to next week's vlog and exploring what we started today. And for a Gypsy Kiss the vlog, I'm Shelley Carney.
And I'm Toby Eunice. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.